Breaking news, it's frickin' hot outside, y'all.
The heat has likely contributed to nearly 36 deaths across 6 states.
This week, a heat wave is expected to break records all across the U.S. About 36 million people are under an excessive heat warning. That's 10% of the U.S. population.
In the summer months, hundreds die here in New York from extreme heat.
Year over year, decade over decade, heat is the single most deadly weather event. More than floods, more than hurricanes, more than tornadoes, and it's not even close. Silent, invisible, and far too easy to underestimate, the U.S. is woefully unprepared for the rising temperatures ahead. As overburdened bureaucracies struggle to find affordable ways to keep residents cool, the power grid is being pushed to its outer limits with each record-breaking summer. Experts warn that mass climate-related migration will transform the country by 2050. Yet Americans keep moving to the hottest parts of the country. The cost of resisting our new reality instead of adapting to it is mounting, and it's only a matter of time before it becomes too expensive to maintain the status quo. What, if anything, are policymakers doing to prepare? From the urban heat island effect and natural gas to outdated disaster categories and $100 million air conditioners, this is why America's cities are so freaking hot. Roll the intro. Thank you to my partner on today's video, Quince. Since we're talking environment, let's talk about clothing. Fast fashion, with its adherence to never-ending trend cycles and use of low-quality materials, means we're going through clothing like never before, and the clothing we do buy only lasts a season before basically deteriorating into scraps. Those scraps end up in landfills, oceans, getting burned into the atmosphere, etc. I do my best to remove myself from the fast fashion cycle as much as possible, and one way to do that is by buying well-made, timeless pieces that will stay in your wardrobe for years, not only because they look great no matter the era, but also because the material is high quality. That's where Quince comes in. Quince is on a mission to provide high-quality clothing without the inflated price tags. This includes organic cotton dresses, 100% cashmere sweaters, washable silk, and so much more. And their premium quality won't break the bank, with prices that are 50 to 80% lower than similar brands. They're able to do this by cutting out the middleman through direct relationships with factories that they vet for ethical labor and material practices. And they work with a lot of the same manufacturers as other big-name brands, so you can get virtually the same pieces for a much lower price. Love that for me. And for you. I've been living in their European linen wide leg pants ever since I went to Europe and saw that they are in fact wearing linen in Europe. It's so comfy on hot days. I also love having one comfortable, classic, easy dress to throw on hot summer days when I do not want any fabric touching me and I want to stay cool. And I love their organic gauze-tiered maxi dress for this. Upgrade your closet with Quince. Go to quince.com/Leeja for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Thanks, Quince. Around 1,220 people in the US die from extreme heat each year, though experts speculate that the real figure could be much higher because all conditions become more deadly. So why don't we take extreme heat more seriously? To put it simply, one of these things is not like the other. Unlike other extreme weather events that leave a more obvious trail of destruction in their wake, FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, doesn't recognize extreme heat as a major disaster. That leaves it up to already cash-strapped state and local governments and community organizations to fund interventions themselves.
In Arizona, if we have 2 weeks of extreme heat, and let's say 400 people die, and we call the federal government and say, hey, we need some assistance here. We need to figure out how to save people. The federal government say, no, that's not an emergency.
This summer, a coalition of environmental, labor, and healthcare groups and state attorneys general have been petitioning FEMA to update its disaster designations. But bureaucracy moves a lot slower than climate change, so it's unclear when or if additional funds may become available. In the meantime, municipalities have experimented with different approaches to raising public awareness around extreme heat. The Arched Rock Foundation has encouraged naming heat waves like we name tropical storms. But the implications of doing so remain unclear. In a 2022 study, which named a particularly brutal July heat wave 𝗬𝗓𝗡𝗧, only 6% of residents were able to recall the name without prompting. And in many cases, what stops people from taking the necessary steps to beat the heat isn't a problem of awareness, but one of opportunity. About 1/3 of US workers have jobs that require them to be outside. Yet OSHA, which creates federal workplace regulations, still doesn't have official standards to protect workers from heat exposure. Even many indoor workers are affected by extreme temperatures. People working in kitchens, warehouses, prisons, assembly lines, and even schools face unbearable heat while just trying to do their jobs. And when the government fails to step in, it's up to individual companies to protect their people. But workplace cultures often push employees to ignore their discomfort and work past their limits, sometimes with deadly consequences. So just to recap, both federal emergency response and workplace safety agencies do not recognize extreme heat as a danger or an emergency. So with just the basics, we're already falling short, and that is to the detriment of all of us. When humans get too hot, we think less clearly, work more slowly, and get injured more often. A recent study found that when working in 90-degree heat, worker productivity drops 25%. When the heat exceeds 100 degrees, productivity drops 70%. The US is already losing around 2.5 billion hours of work per year to extreme heat. That translates to around $100 billion of economic losses annually, and that figure is expected to rise to $500 billion a year by 2050. And as much as I wish the people who run major corporations gave a shit about heat out of the goodness of their heart, or we lived in a system where they had to, that's not the reality. Bottom lines are top of mind, so we have to appeal to that. And the reality is that it is incredibly more expensive in almost all scenarios related to climate change to not address the issue. But there's something about our little human monkey brains that really struggles with the object permanence when something is too abstract or far off in the future. And that's a problem when it comes to climate change, especially where extreme heat is concerned. When the air in the environment gets too hot, meaning hotter than the skin's average temperature of around 95 degrees, the body takes heat on instead of expelling it. The first serious consequence is heat exhaustion, which causes an overall sense of fatigue and loss of muscle function as the body tries to limit the amount of heat that it's producing. If a person's internal temperature continues to rise past 104 degrees, they risk heat stroke, which can lead to multi-organ failure and death. In extreme cases, the fastest remedy is an ice bath, and if that's not available, placing ice on parts of the body where the veins are close to the surface, like the neck, chest, wrists, and temples, can also be effective. Extreme heat prevents the body from leveraging its natural cooling mechanisms, namely increasing blood circulation and sweating. But both of these mechanisms tend to be compromised in older adults, so elderly people are particularly vulnerable to heat. Our body's ability to lose heat declines by about 5% every decade, the wrong direction for a planet that's only getting hotter. Remember when climate change just used to be called global warming? Scientists have been warning for years that if we didn't stop dumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, temperatures would inevitably rise, and that if those temperatures exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit past pre-industrial temperatures, we'd unleash severe climate change impacts, including more frequent and severe droughts, heat waves, and rainfall. Yet we've failed to step back from that precipice. June 2024 was the 12th consecutive month of reaching or exceeding the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. And in July, temperatures exceeded last year's record-breaking heat 2 days in a row. Cities in particular have emerged as hotspots, prone to even higher temperatures than surrounding areas, thanks to what's known as the urban heat island effect. Here's how it works. When we build cities, we tend to replace naturally cooling trees and other plants with large tracts of concrete and asphalt, which absorb heat during the day and release it at night. Once built, densely packed skyscrapers limit wind flow and trap pockets of heat. All the while, millions of residents pour waste heat from their gas car exhausts, air conditioners, and bodies into the mix. As a result, city temperatures in the US are consistently 5 to 8 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than the surrounding area. And that disparity could rise as high as 20 degrees in the coming years. The urban heat island effect is becoming a major problem in the US, where nearly 85% of the population lives in a metropolitan area. But that additional heat isn't evenly distributed throughout cities. Low-income neighborhoods and communities of color are disproportionately burdened. A recent study from Columbia University found that in 84% of major American cities, historically redlined neighborhoods saw significantly hotter summers than other parts of the same city. Why? Well, redlining. Redlining, as you may recall from my video about why the US is so ugly, refers to the discriminatory practice originated by lenders in the 1930s using maps like this. Neighborhoods with high percentages of Black people were outlined in red, designating them as high-risk areas for mortgage lending. This led to a systemic denial of home loans or insurance to people based on the racial or ethnic composition of their neighborhoods. This, coupled with racist zoning laws and exclusionary neighborhood policies, trapped Black people into blighted areas while undermining their ability to create intergenerational wealth through homeownership. While wealthy neighborhoods tend to have more abundant greenery and generally feel less densely packed, predominantly Black neighborhoods have often been purposely zoned for industrial activity, so they're more dense and covered with big buildings and concrete that soak up heat. A recent 538 analysis found that nearly all formerly redlined zones in the country remain disproportionately Black, Latino, or Asian compared with the surrounding metro area. This interactive map details urban heat in formerly redlined neighborhoods across the US. I'll link it below so you can play around with it, but if you look at Manhattan, you can see a dramatic difference in heat between the neighborhoods surrounding Central Park, some of which are a full degrees Celsius cooler than the city average, versus the Bronx, which was redlined as hell and remains 99% minority populated and is fully 2 degrees Celsius hotter than the city average. This pattern can be found in cities throughout the United States. But it doesn't have to be this way. There are some really exciting, innovative ways to combat the heat that we're all trapped in. The first one is a simple one. Plant more trees. When it comes to combating the urban heat island effect, trees are a triple threat. They create shade, they help cool the air when they release moisture from their leaves, and they absorb harmful carbon dioxide. According to climate scientist Brian Stone Jr., if you wanted to invent the most effective kind of climate management technology from the ground up, you could spend a lot of time trying to do that. You would just engineer a tree. Nationwide, environmental groups and city governments have implemented free tree planting initiatives, sometimes with goals as ambitious as planting 1 million trees. But though trees are undeniably awesome, it takes a lot of them to provide enough shade to meaningfully cool down all the millions of people trying to cool down in cities across the country. Trees do a great job of cooling a city overall, but when it comes to how hot an individual person feels, the amount of sun hitting their body is by far the most important factor. Blocking the sun can lower how hot a person feels by 36 to 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's where built shade comes in. Examples of built shade are already all around us. Bus shelters, shop awnings, and shade sails, those large pieces of fabric often in swoopy triangular shapes you can see on playgrounds. However, only about 10% of cities have built shade even on their radar as a solution. And those that do are often in desert regions like Phoenix, where extra water to support more trees is scarce. One big reason cities may not be leaning into built shade: bureaucracy.
So for example, if I want to put a shade structure up, well, who owns the air rights above that space? You may own, but be a private landowner that owns the building, but the Department of Transportation or the Parks Department might own the space above. There already, you've got 4 different people that need to make decisions about one overhang or one awning.
Another man-made option is so-called cool roofing, which uses special coatings or reflective shingles to bounce the sun's energy back up into space. In 2015, Los Angeles became the first major US city to require that all new residential construction feature cool roofs by default. And since cool roofs can cost slightly more than traditional ones, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power offers rebates to incentivize homeowners to make the switch. But to trigger widespread adoption, many more governments will need to update their municipal codes to push the industry towards cool roofs. Indeed, regulation would help move all of this along. There are many passive cooling techniques that have been working around the world for literal centuries that the folks designing cookie-cutter developments and office buildings routinely ignore. For example, wind towers are found in residential and commercial buildings all over the Middle East. They're basically towers with openings at the top that capture the prevailing local winds, then direct them into the interior of the building through a series of ducts and openings. Another common architectural element from that region is a type of wooden lattice or screen, usually placed on windows, balconies, and other openings in buildings, providing privacy and shade while allowing air and light to flow inside. In some cases, clay pots filled with water, sand, or damp straw are included to help enhance the cooling effect. But instead of leveraging these techniques and updating building standards to help get ahead of rising temperatures, the US has largely opted to deny that anything is going on at all.
It'll start getting cooler. You just watch.
I wish science agreed with you.
So Obama's talking about all of this with the global warming and that, and a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax.
This earth warming and carbon is actually healthy for us.
God changes the climate. God changes the climate.
As a developed, wealthy nation in the Northern Hemisphere, Americans have overall been far more insulated from the effects of a heating globe than most folks around the world. First off, we're removed from our food and water sources, so the threat to these factors remains abstract and therefore easier to ignore. Out of sight, out of mind. Furthermore, our culture tends to see every problem as being solvable with enough money and technology. It's part of the reason Americans keep flocking to the hottest parts of the country despite rising temperatures. According to an analysis from the real estate website Redfin, all 50 of the U.S. counties with the largest share of homes facing high climate and extreme weather risk experienced positive net migration between 2016 and 2020. The population in Maricopa County, where Phoenix is, grew 14% in the past decade. And this isn't just because Americans just tend to prefer warmer climates, which the majority of us do, but not me. I'm sweaty, I'm from Minnesota. I will take the cold any day you can fight me about it. These hotter areas often have more job opportunities and are more affordable to live in than other parts of the country. So people are choosing what's livable in the short term over what might be survivable 20 years from now. In 2022, the First Street Foundation, a nonprofit that assesses future climate risks, released a model predicting a massive increase in the number of Americans who will experience a heat index at or above 125 degrees Fahrenheit. 125 degrees is currently the threshold for the National Weather Service's highest category for heat, which is when heat stroke is highly likely. In 2022, an estimated 8 million people in the US experienced heat at this level. 30 years from now, that figure is expected to increase 13 times to around 107 million people in 2053. That's about a third of our current population. The increase in extreme danger days will be concentrated in the middle of the country in what's been dubbed the heat belt. It's expected to form along the Mississippi River, taking over more of Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Iowa, and Indiana, plus parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kentucky, and Tennessee. We've crunched the numbers, and it turns out that commenting on our videos is the single biggest way that you can help this channel grow. So please leave a comment. It's quick, it's easy, and it's free, and it really helps this channel grow. Thanks. Air conditioners keep us cool by pumping indoor heat outside, basically recycling it across the city. Like refrigerators, most air conditioners use hydrofluorocarbons, potent greenhouse gases that leak into the atmosphere along with all the extra heat. Air conditioners alone are currently responsible for about 7% of annual greenhouse gas emissions worldwide, and that figure is expected to triple by 2050 as the world keeps getting hotter and we keep needing more and more cool air to literally stay alive. A horrific, self-perpetuating cycle. Though hydrofluorocarbons are being phased out and replaced with more energy-efficient coolants, for now, America's most popular cooling method still comes at a high environmental cost. And not only do air conditioners give off undesirable stuff, they also take in a lot of precious energy. And our power grid simply wasn't built to handle so much demand. The national power grid has now survived multiple record-breaking summers in a row. So far, we've been able to crank our ACs and fans without triggering a major blackout. Still, energy experts warn that past successes may not guarantee stability in the future, especially as demands from power-guzzling AI increases. Yes, your little ChatGPT searches and other AI usage already take up as much energy as a small country, and it's only growing. The US still primarily runs on fossil fuels, coal, and nuclear power, but solar power is becoming incredibly important. Experts say that without solar power, the grid wouldn't have fared nearly so well the past 2 years. For what should be obvious reasons, solar tends to perform particularly well during heat waves, and changing your home over to solar power may actually be a lot easier and more affordable than you think. So I recently looked into installing solar panels on my roof and was surprised at how accessible it really is. Minneapolis, along with many major cities around the country, uses net metering, meaning you're still attached to the grid and any energy your panels create that you don't use gets sold back to the utility company, and they literally cut you a check every month. On top of that, at least for now, and probably as long as a Democrat is in office, the federal government will give you a 30% tax credit on the cost of your system, which can amount to thousands of dollars in tax breaks. Additionally, solar panel installation takes just a couple days and requires nearly zero maintenance. It takes literal softball-sized hail to break one of these things, and as long as you have critter guards to keep any pesky animals from chewing the cords, they'll last 30+ years with zero maintenance. You don't have to clear the snow, you just set it and forget it. And they come standard with an app on your phone so you can easily see that all of the panels are working or troubleshoot it if they're not. And labor warranties come standard, at least with the installation companies I spoke with, so if something does break, you're covered. And the sides of your roof don't need to face south. Mine face east and west. They just need to get solid amounts of sun and not have too much tree coverage. And even a few panels can offset a lot of energy usage. There is a large upfront cost, though there are many neighborhoods, cities, and states that help provide low-interest funding, and the tax breaks and potential energy income make the math start mathing real nice. When I did the math for a large system to cover my entire roof, paid for with a 6 to 7% interest loan from a local clean energy nonprofit, including the offset from income I would generate from the extra energy, a full system that would cover all of my electricity needs and then some would cost about $200 a month. I would have zero electricity bill, and that's not even including the thousands in tax credits I would also receive. My property value would increase by about the cost of the total install, and in Minneapolis, they don't charge sales tax or property tax on solar. Even in Minneapolis, where it's frigid for half the year, going solar just makes sense. Now, if you don't own your home or you're not in a position to transition to solar power, there's still plenty that you can do to help prevent blackouts, including setting your thermostat a few degrees higher, not cooling unused rooms, and waiting to do energy-intensive activities like running a washing machine or dishwasher until off-peak hours. But what about people who don't have air conditioning at all? How are they expected to survive increasingly brutal summer heat? As of 2020, 12% of US homes had no access to air conditioning. That's around 27 million households. And most often, those with little or no AC were occupied by low-income residents, often renters and people of color. In a survey of housing regulations in all 50 US states, Reuters found that while nearly half require landlords to maintain existing air conditioning units, none mandate that air conditioning be provided. Air conditioning isn't considered an essential service like plumbing, heat, and electricity. But a growing number of US states, cities, and counties have made moves to legislate maximum indoor temperature standards on rental housing. 6 localities, including New Orleans and Clark County, Nevada, have managed to pass these cooling laws in the past 5 years, but landlords groups across the country are doing everything they can to reverse the trend. They successfully killed bills in California, Texas, and Arkansas after landlords claimed they'd be forced to raise rents to compensate for the cost of cooling upgrades. Check out my video about why mass ownership of rental property should be illegal for a deep dive on the evils of landlords. One landlord group even submitted an audacious complaint to the Hot Springs, Arkansas City Council, claiming that cooling requirements would hurt the most vulnerable in our community by making affordable housing difficult, if not impossible, to provide. Really? Window units cost around $400 tops, and electrical upgrades for homes to support the unit can run between $2,000 and $3,000. Upgrading a single-family home to central AC costs between $5,000 and $10,000, and that's a lot for homeowners who just have the one home they live in, but we're talking real estate investors. Even if they couldn't afford it outright, as property owners, landlords could easily leverage their equity for loans to reinvest in those properties if they wanted to. They just don't want to because they don't give a shit, and as of yet they haven't been forced to by regulations. In New York City, lawmakers are moving to protect tenants from heat the same way they're protected from cold. Newly proposed legislation would fine landlords who fail to buy, install, and maintain air conditioning units or cooling systems for tenants during the summer $1,250 per day. Suddenly, even a $10,000 installation doesn't seem so steep, right? Though 91% of New York City households already had some form of air conditioning as of 2017, about 350 New Yorkers still die each year from heat-related illnesses. And Black New Yorkers are twice as likely to die from heat as white residents. For those without home access to air conditioning, community cooling centers can offer much-needed respite, mostly during the day. Because most cooling centers are volunteer-run, they often close down at night, which can become problematic when the temperatures stay stifling long after the sun has gone down. For example, Maricopa County, Arizona experienced more than 30 days where evening temperatures exceeded 90 degrees.
Across Maricopa County, the Heat Relief Network has this interactive map showing you where you can get out of the heat. But then this map shows you what's open after 8 p.m. and there are only a handful of cooling or respite centers open in the entire valley.
Most cooling center regulars tend to be older and poorer than the general population, and many are unhoused. This has created a social stigma around cooling centers that causes many people to think of them as a last resort instead of a daily reprieve. But it's predicted that as electricity gets more and more expensive, the appeal of cooling centers will still likely broaden. Pretty much any municipal building with air conditioning can be turned into a cooling center with some extra staff and bottles of water. But like I said, many localities struggle to find the funds. And whether or not they gain access to much needed federal support will depend largely on who's in the White House. In 2015, 195 countries signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, pledging to substantially reduce global greenhouse gas emissions to limit global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In 2020, Trump made good on his promise to remove the U.S. from the agreement. It was the finale of 4 straight years of climate terrorism by the former president. During his term, Trump approved the Keystone Oil Pipeline, expedited the controversial Dakota Access Pipeline, and signed an executive order to expand offshore drilling. He also rolled back more than 100 environmental regulations, most of them aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Trump vehemently opposes renewable energy. He's claimed that wind farms cause cancer. They don't, and has called electrical vehicles an assassination of jobs. In general, Trump likes to pretend that any climate action would be bad for the economy. So how'd Biden do? In 2022, the Biden administration passed its signature climate law, the Inflation Reduction Act, the largest climate spending bill in history. It provides billions of dollars in tax credits to help build renewable energy plants, create battery factories, retrofit homes to make them more efficient, introduce more nature-friendly agricultural practices, buy electric vehicles, and more. In its first year, the IRA created 170,000 clean energy jobs and is projected to create 1.5 million more over the next decade. Biden also set new rules that include limits on emissions that effectively require electric vehicles to account for a majority of new cars sold by 2032. Furthermore, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is set to establish 2 virtual research centers to help communities manage and improve resilience to extreme heat. Reminder that Project 2025 calls for the NOAA to be dismantled as part of its attack on the so-called administrative state. They seem to think that if we simply stop tracking climate change, it'll just go away. However, Biden's climate record has been far from perfect. Despite saying this on the campaign trail:
no more drilling on federal lands, no more drilling, including offshore. No ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period.
He allowed several major oil and gas projects to go through, including a permit for the Mountain Valley Pipeline in West Virginia and the Willow Project in Alaska. There's also concern that progress in curbing emissions could be slowed by the Inflation Reduction Act's many policies, excluding green tech made in China, which is often the cheapest and most efficient option available. If Trump wins a second term, he's pledged to rescind every one of Biden's regulations designed to accelerate the transition to renewable energy. He's also promised to oil executives to reverse regulations that negatively affect them and said that they should therefore give his campaign $1 billion. Classic. Both Trump and Project 2025 have separately called for dismantling energy transition programs and renewable tax credits. Like, I've been looking into solar panels for my house because, like, TikTok, you know what I mean? If things go south in November, those incentivizing tax credits that would put thousands of dollars back in consumer pockets would go away. So please vote. Project 2025 also explicitly calls for increasing fossil fuel productions and proclaims that the federal government has a, quote, obligation to develop vast oil and gas and coal resources on public lands. In March last year, the news service Carbon Brief estimated that a second Trump term could result in over 4 billion extra tons of U.S. emissions by 2030. Trump would, quote, negate twice over all of the savings from deploying wind, solar, and other clean technologies around the world over the past 5 years. All this despite the fact that nearly 7 out of 10 voters, including half of Republicans, believe the U.S. should continue investing in clean energy manufacturing. Now, how about Harris? According to reporting by Data for Progress, a majority of voters support Kamala Harris's record on climate, which so far includes passing a law to replace 100% of lead pipes, announcing the first ever limits on cancer-causing forever chemicals to protect drinking water, taking an oil company to court for potential criminal violations after an oil pipeline spill poisoned coastal waters, and leading an investigation into Exxon for its actions to mislead the American public about its awareness of and role in worsening climate change. I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of Earth, and it seems pretty clear that if we want to be able to continue living here, electing Kamala Harris is our best bet. The pressure and work continues after November, but with a President Harris, the work would include progressing forward instead of the President Trump scenario where we'd be fighting the state to even just remain at the current status quo. And whatever happens in November, heat will still likely be the defining human rights issue of the 21st century. Currently, about 1% of the Earth's surface is intolerably hot, uninhabitable. By 2070, which is a year when I very much still plan on being alive, and you might also, that figure could increase to 20%. With as much as 1/5 of the entire world heading towards becoming uninhabitable, experts predict mass migrations both within and between countries. In the US, studies suggest that 1 in 12 Americans in the southern half of the country will move towards California, the Mountain West, or the Northwest over the next 45 years due to climate influences alone. The ability to migrate is already a reflection of relative wealth. Those who can't afford to move will be left behind, risking becoming trapped as support from both the land and the society around them dries up. This process has already begun in rural Louisiana and coastal Georgia, where low-income and Black and Indigenous communities face environmental change on top of poor health and extreme poverty. These problems are massive, and that can be really overwhelming. That's part of why people have such a hard time being proactive about climate change. One terrifying data point after the next makes us feel numb and powerless. But there are things we can do, from big picture actions like voting in representatives who are prepared to fight climate change and then keeping the pressure on them to deliver once they're in office, all the way to small daily actions to support our neighbors on hot days, like keeping a cooler of water bottles on the front porch or planting some trees. Don't underestimate the value of offering a cold drink of water or some shade to someone in need. But also don't underestimate the value of showing up to vote in November. A vote is not the final solution, but just one easy thing that you can do to move the needle towards a better future for everyone. Thanks to my newest patrons, special thanks to my royal patrons, and an extra special shout out to my multi-platinum patrons 𝗬𝗓𝗓𝗏, Joshua Coles, Thomas Johnson, Sophia Sams, Anthony Giles, Tay, and Brett Piontek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you'd like ad-free access to all these videos, check out my Patreon today. If you enjoyed this video, you'll also like the one I made about why the US is so ugly. And if you got this far in the video, comment a little shooting star emoji so I know who you are. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.